So for those of you who have never met me before, my name is Maddie Koenig, and I am one of the park naturalists at Gulf Branch Nature Center, which is run and operated by Arlington County's Department of Parks and Recreation. So our other nature center here in Arlington County that is run by Parks and Rec is Long Branch, which is our sister center. And collectively, there are 4 full-time naturalists who work for Arlington County, and I'm one of them. So tonight we're going to be reviewing the basics of evergreen tree identification. My goal for the program is to have you sort of more comfortable with our evergreens that you can find in Arlington County. And I really want to give you a framework so that you can start to figure out what it is that you have maybe in your yard or around your home or in your neighborhood. So the goal is to have a framework by the end of the program and just get you introduced to some common species that you might find here in Arlington. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? No questions? Okay, then we're going to jump right in. What I'm going to do is share some slides as always. So in a minute, my face is going to be small in the corner, I think like it is right now, and you'll see my slides. So let's give that a go. Okay, can everybody see a page that says Evergreen Tree Identification? If you cannot, now would be the time to say, I'm not seeing it. If I don't hear anything, I'm going to assume you are all seeing what I am seeing. Okay, and you should still be able to see me down in the corner. If you can't, no big deal. I'm not the focus, right? The knowledge is the focus. So let's jump right in. Okay. So when we are talking about evergreen this evening, what I mean is trees that are green all year round. Evergreen is not a scientific classification. It's sort of a casual, colloquial term for trees that are green right through the winter time. So I do want us to understand that not all evergreen trees are conifers, right? Those classic pine trees that bear cones. And not all conifers are evergreens. And we've got some examples of trees that sort of break that rule here on the right? There are broadleaf evergreen trees out there. In our area, those are some of our magnolias, some of our holly species, and of course, a lot of the broadleaf trees, right, in warmer parts of the world around the equator are evergreen because it never is really winter there, right? The climate is pretty consistent, so those trees hold on to their leaves all year long and don't lose them on a seasonal basis. Alternately, we do have conifers that lose their leaves, right? So there are trees out there, our larches, our bald cypress, and some of our pond cypresses, as well as the dawn redwood, that when we look at them, we think, oh, that's kind of our classic coniferous tree, except that they lose their leaves in the wintertime. Okay, so there are always exceptions to the rule. So again, tonight we are focusing on trees that are green through the winter or green all year round. Okay, so when we start to think about our evergreen trees, one of the first questions we can ask ourselves are the leaves broad, right? Are we looking at a broadleaf evergreen tree? So are the leaves broad, flat, and a bit waxy? And if that's the case, we are probably looking at a tree that is either in the holly family or the magnolia family. So in our area, American holly is our native holly tree. You can see it here on the right. And then English holly, you'll often find commonly planted in yards. So they are very similar in a lot of ways. English holly is going to be different from American holly in that the leaves can be variegated, which means they can have sort of those 2 different colors that we're seeing here in the left picture, but that's not always the case. You will hear folks describe American holly as being sort of less glossy and less shiny. The upper sides of the leaves can be a little bit more dull unless the leaves are very new and fresh. But it can certainly be difficult to
We're not seeing your screen sharing.
You're not seeing my screen? Is that the case for everybody or just one group?
I can see it.
I can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
I see it.
Yeah. I can see it.
I can see it.
What I'm going to do is just go ahead and stop sharing for a second, and then I'm going to try sharing again. And if there's anybody who maybe just came in, perhaps for whatever reason, there's a glitch in the system and you missed it somehow. So let's try that. I also am going to spotlight myself, so hopefully that will help. Let's try again. Okay, if you still cannot see my screen share, let me know. Are we doing better here? Okay, I'm hearing silence, so I'm assuming that means that everybody can see what the rest of us are seeing. Okay, we are back on the page with our hollies. I will say I just wanted to kind of end this slide by saying that it can be really difficult to distinguish between the two, and there are all kinds of hybrid varieties of hollies that, you know, are American holly mixed with an ornamental or non-native variety. So if you've got a plant with shiny, prickly leaves and red berries, you can kind of rest assured and know that it is a holly. In terms of getting a little bit more specific, sometimes you might need a guide, or sometimes you probably just have to tell yourself, right, this is as close as I can get. Other broadleaf evergreen trees in our area are some of our magnolias. So our southern magnolia, which you're seeing here, that has the really big dark glossy leaves that are brown and fuzzy underneath, is evergreen all year long. And then our sweet bay magnolia, which is one of our native magnolias, also has large dark glossy leaves, but they're typically silvery underneath. They don't have that brown fuzzy quality. And if we have a mild winter, they can be evergreen. Sometimes if our winters are particularly harsh, sweet bay magnolia will lose its leaves. So sometimes evergreen, sometimes not, right? If you've got a tree with big, right, like 8 inches plus long leaves that are glossy on top, sometimes fuzzy underneath, sometimes silvery underneath, you know you've got a magnolia, okay? As we go along this evening, I have put non-native species in red. So when you're looking at the slides and you see text that's red, that's indicating that it is either a species that is from a totally different continent or just happens to be native to another region of North America, as is the case with southern magnolia. So their native range is going to be a little further south than Virginia. Okay. So once we've got kind of our broadleaf evergreens out of the way, we're going to look at our evergreens that we really typically think of as evergreen when that image comes to mind. And the first question we want to ask ourselves are the leaves needle-like, which is what we're seeing here on the left, or are the leaves scale-like, which is what we're seeing here on the right? And that term scale-like can be a little confusing until you look at the leaves up close, which is what we're seeing here in the photograph, right? All of these little overlapping pieces are what we're referring to when we say scale-like, right? Those little overlapping leaves look like scales on a fish or scales on a snake. And so that's what we mean when we say scale-like. Okay. When you kind of zoom out, you don't always get that view of scale-like leaves, but here it is. So we're going to kind of go through and treat the rest of the presentation a little bit like a dichotomous key, where we will take a look at all of the evergreens that have needle-like leaves and start to think about how we can break that down into species, right, that have specific characteristics. And we'll kind of do the same with our scale-like leaved evergreens. Okay. We doing okay so far? Again, feel free to unmute yourself at any point if you have questions or something you'd like to share. Okay, so we're going to start by taking a look at our needle-like leaves. So let's say you're out there and you're looking at an evergreen tree and it's got needles, right? Like your classic pine tree. The question you want to ask yourself is, are these needles clustered, meaning they're kind of all growing out of the same point on the twig, or are they not clustered or individually coming out of the twig? Okay. Clustered needles are sometimes called, those clusters are sometimes called bundles, sometimes they're called fascicles, sometimes they're called clusters, right? But you're looking for groups of needles that are either clustered, coming out of the same point on a twig, or not clustered. If those needles are clustered, we can start kind of breaking things down by counting how many needles are in each cluster. So at each point where the needles are coming out of the twig, are there 2 needles coming out of the twig? Are there 3 needles coming out of the twig in one point, or are there 5 needles coming out of the twig in one point, right? So if you've got 2 needles in each cluster, 2 needles coming out of the twig at each point, right? Chances are you are looking at one of the 3 species that you see here. The most common is probably our Virginia pine. It's got short needles that are twisted. Sometimes they twist around each other. Sometimes they twist away from each other. And the cones of Virginia pine have what we call prickles, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. A Scotch pine is another commonly planted pine tree in our area. It is not native, it's native to Europe, but it is commonly planted, and it does have, just like the Virginia pine, 2 needles that are twisty, but its cones don't have prickles, and they typically point back along the twig, which is what we're seeing here in the lower left photo, right? Instead of pointing out or pointing forwards to the end of the twig, they grow facing back towards the trunk of the tree. Okay, and then finally we have our Table Mountain pine, which you're probably not going to find here in Arlington, but is certainly special to the mountains of Virginia. So if you're out in the Blue Ridge or in the mountains, you can look for Table Mountain pine as well. Okay, I'm going to zoom ahead here to just take a look at what I mean when I say, are the cones prickly or not? Right, so when we're looking at cones, you can see the cone scales, which are these pieces, sometimes have a pointy, prickly piece, and sometimes they don't. So that can be an identifying characteristic when we get past needles and how many needles and clusters or not. We can start to look at the cones of the tree, the shape of those cones, the size of those cones, and whether or not those cones have prickles, how long the prickles are, if they're sort of short and stout the way they are in a loblolly pine here in the middle, or if they are actually quite long and become very thin the way you see in a Virginia pine. Red pine and Scotch pine are going to have cones that don't have prickles at all, okay? So if there are 2 to 3 needles in each cluster, right? Sometimes 2, sometimes 3, maybe on the tree itself. There are clusters with 2 and clusters with 3 right next to each other. You're looking at either shortleaf pine or red pine. And again, red pine is not native to our area, but is commonly planted. So for shortleaf pine, right, you're going to see, again, needles that are slightly twisted and cones that have a thin prickle. But for red pine, right, those cones don't have a prickle, so that can help you distinguish between the 2 species. The needles of red pine are going to be a little bit longer, and one characteristic of red pine is that the needles will snap easily when they bend. So that's not the case for all pine trees, right? Sometimes you can kind of press on those needles and curve them without that snap that you'll find on red pine. Okay. Anybody have questions so far about clusters of needles and how we might look at needles, what I mean by needles? We're doing okay?
Will you be sending out a copy of your PowerPoint?
Always, yep, always. And again, it's being recorded right now, so you know, if you don't want to be on the record, go ahead and leave your camera off. But our goal usually when we make the recordings is to clean them up a little bit and then get them posted on our Nature and History YouTube page so you can review them again. But I will be sending out copies of the slides, so you'll have all this information, if not tomorrow, then by Friday. Okay. So moving along here, remember when we're looking at those clusters of needles, we can look at clusters of 2, 2 to 3, 3 or 5. So these are our pine trees in our area that have 3 needles in each cluster. The first is pitch pine. And one sort of identifying characteristic of pitch pine is that the cones can be really flat at the base, which you can sort of see in this picture, right? Those cone scales almost make like a nice little saucer or dish before they kind of expand outwards into the cone. Other cones are going to be much more kind of elongated, right? Pond pine is next. You're really only going to find pond pine in the coastal plains, so we don't find them too much here in Arlington, and certainly if you're in the western part of the state, you're not going to be finding pond pine. The cones can be prickly, but the prickle may also be absent, so they're not typically very prickly compared to some of our other species. And then finally, we have our loblolly pine, which has very long needles, usually 7 inches long. Its cones have very stout, fat prickles, which you can see in the photo here. Even at a little bit of a distance, those prickles show up. And again, very, very long needles, right, in groups of 3. Okay. I forgot to tell you some little mnemonics that help remember some of these. So if we go back to our Virginia pine, I typically think of Virginia, right? And if I hold my fingers up like a V, right, that looks like the 2 needles, right, that are in each cluster. And then for our loblolly pine, right, when we say loblolly, right, we're hearing that L 3 times. So loblolly, right, helps us to remember 3 needles in a cluster, loblolly. Hopefully that helps. Okay. I will say that some of what we call our southeastern pines, right, our loblolly pine, our pitch pine, our pond pine, our shortleaf pine, our longleaf pine, which is much less common in our area, much common further south, all of these species hybridize. And that's in part because they are closely related to each other on the tree of life, but also because a lot of our conifers, or I'd say most of our conifers are what we call wind pollinated. So when the pollen goes to spread from one tree to another, it's carried by the wind, and there's really sort of no kind of rhyme or reason to which way that pollen goes. So that pollen can end up, right, going from a pitch pine to a loblolly, and that seed will end up being a hybrid of a pitch pine and a loblolly. So it can make identification out in the field really complicated. So if you're out there and you're like, I don't know if this is a shortleaf pine or a loblolly pine, right? Chances are it could be a hybrid, right? So don't feel too bad if you can't totally do it in the field without all of your identifying characteristics being present. The bark, the cones, the needles, the length of the needles, right? Whether or not the cone has prickles. Sometimes all of these identifying characteristics aren't going to be present on one tree at any given time of the year. So again, particularly with these pine trees, it's okay to get, as close as you can. Know that even the experts have some difficulty. In general, we can break our pine trees into a group that we call yellow pines and a group that we call white pines. So all the pines that we've talked about before, we would put into that yellow pine group. Yellow pines typically have rough twigs like we're seeing over here in the right photo where the needles have fallen off, and most of them have prickly cones, right? So they've got those prickles on the ends of the cone scales. Our white pines, on the other hand, typically have smoother twigs. When you touch the twig, you're not going to feel that rough bumpiness where some of the past needles have fallen off. And white pines do not have prickles on their cones ever, okay? Yellow and white pine, again, is sort of a more informal, colloquial way to separate our pine trees. My understanding is that it actually has to do with the lumber that these species of trees produce. Not that white pine necessarily makes a white board, right? But that board is going to have sort of less obvious grain in it than our yellow pine does. So it will still sort of look yellowy, the wood will, but it has a less obvious grain. And so that's one reason that I have discovered why, we make this these 2 distinguishing groups, yellow pine and white pine, has more to do with the lumber and the sort of economic uses of these trees than the sort of ecological differences. But some of these superficial differences can kind of help us group the trees into 2 different categories. Okay, so we're going to finally move on to our white pine. Right, in our area, we just have our eastern white pine, and it is really the most common tree you'll find in our area that has those 5 needles in each cluster. Another kind of helpful sort of little mnemonic to help you remember, right? 5 needles in an eastern white pine, white, W-H-I-T-E, 5 letters in the word white for a tree with 5 needles in each cluster. So really, this is going to be your big sort of distinguishing feature for your white pine. The cones look very different than they do Are you guys still able to see me in addition to the slides, or can you only see the slides?
I can see you.
Both.
You can see me?
Yes.
Okay, so like if I hold up a white pine cone, you can see that pretty well. I'm probably very small.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So our white pine cones look very different than our pines from any of the other trees we've looked at so far. The scales, right, are much paperier, not as stout or thick, and they never ever have prickles. So there's no prickles on the ends of those scales. They also can be really sappy, right? So when you touch a white pine cone, sometimes you come away with sticky fingers. So that can also kind of help you identify, yeah, this is a white pine, and in particular in our area, it's going to be the eastern white pine. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our evergreens with needle-like leaves with needles in clusters. Now we're going to move on to evergreen trees with needle-like leaves that are individually attached to the twig. So no more clusters, right? We've got individual needles attached to the twig. And the first group are going to be needles that are four-sided. So if you were to roll them between your fingers, they wouldn't roll easily, right? You would feel some harsh edges. And they're very stiff and also pointy at the end. So if you were to kind of take a handful of this tree, you might say, ouch, right? It's going to hurt a little bit because you've got pointy, stiff, four-sided needles. And that is always going to tell you that what you are looking at is some type of spruce, okay? Spruce trees are not native to our area. You can find them in colder parts of the world and also in the mountains. The only native spruce that you're seeing here is the red spruce, which is native to the mountains of Virginia. And my understanding is that is actually on the decline, even in the mountains. So if you are kind of walking around your neighborhood and you come across a tree with individual needles, right, that are not clustered and they are four-sided and stiff and pointy, chances are you're looking at either a Norway spruce or a blue spruce, which are non-native species that are kind of commonly planted as landscape plants. Other indicators that you're looking at a spruce are that the cones droop, so the cones hang down. They don't kind of stand up, and they often hang in clusters. So this is a spruce cone, and it's got these really papery looking cone scales. No prickles, right? The needles are prickly enough. Okay. The bark is usually flaky and the twigs are usually orange for our spruce trees. Okay. A Norway spruce is going to have branches that droop. A blue spruce typically does not. So in the right here, we're looking at sort of that classic Norway spruce shape of drooping branches, drooping twigs, drooping cones, all with pointy individual needles. Okay. If the needles are not clustered, so you've got individual needles, and they are sort of round, right? So if you rolled them between your fingers, you would not feel hard edges. They roll nicely between your fingers. Also pretty soft and blunt tipped. You may be looking at a type of fir. And we don't have firs that are native to Arlington, but balsam firs and then the common Douglas fir, which is a Douglas fir, not a fir, a little different, kind of confusing, not super important to get into tonight. They are commonly cultivated. They are sometimes used as Christmas trees. If you've got neighbors who've planted their Christmas tree outside, right, you might end up with a balsam fir or a common Douglas fir in your neighborhood. So the cones on a lot of firs actually stand upright like you're seeing on your balsam fir. And then for your Douglas firs, the cones sometimes have these papery little bracts that hang underneath the scales. So that can be an identifying characteristic as well. Okay. Again, these are trees that are not native to our area. If you're seeing them in your neighborhood, it's because someone has planted them. So they've got individual needles, right? That are round, so you can roll them between your fingers, and they have blunt tips or rounded tips. Okay. All right, we're going to move on to our next group. If everyone's ready. So if the needles are not clustered, again, we're looking at individual needles still, and they are flat needles, so not four-sided, not round, right? Flat. If you tried to roll them between your fingers, you'd have a tough time doing it. right? But they do have blunt tips or rounded tips. Chances are you're looking at a type of yew, okay? We have just one native yew in our area. It's the Canada yew, and it's a shrub. It's not a tree. So if you're looking at something that is taller than you are, that you have to walk around, right, or walk underneath, you are looking at a non-native yew, either an English yew or a Japanese yew. There are tons of ornamental varieties of yews. English and Japanese yews can hybridize, right, whether intentionally or not. So it can be really difficult to get down to a species level identification. But if you've got an evergreen with those individual needles that are flat and blunt tipped or rounded on the tips, and they're pale underneath, you're looking at a yew. Yews also have these really fascinating berry-like cones that are sort of bright red and bright orange, and they're super cool. So this is definitely an indicator that you have a yew. This, right, when they don't have their sort of cone structures at other times of year, they can be a little tougher. But in this picture here on the top right, you're seeing sort of the pollen bearing cones that will open up next spring and spread pollen, okay? So sometimes those are kind of clustered along the twig and can help as an identifying feature. All right, we're ready for our next group. Okay. Again, we're looking at needles that are not clustered, so needles that are individually connected to the stem. Like yews, they are going to have flat needles, so they will not roll nicely between your fingers. They're short and they almost always have silvery undersides, which you can see in this right picture. And that silvery underside is created by 2 rows of stomata, which are leaf openings that allow the leaf to photosynthesize and transpire, but those 2 rows of stomata make sort of a silvery underside from a distance. And if this is the case, right, you've checked up all these boxes, then you've got a hemlock. It could be an eastern hemlock, it could be a Carolina hemlock. Most common in our area are the eastern hemlocks. They've got teeny tiny dangling cones. So let's see, I have one here. They're very small, right? You want to look at me instead of slides, you can see this is our eastern hemlock cone. It's like the same size as my thumbnail. We compare that to a white pine cone. You can see they're really very cute and petite. I loved these as a kid, so hemlocks have kind of a special place in my heart. Hemlocks are on the decline because of a tiny aphid-like insect that will suck the sap. And that, of course, weakens the tree and opens the tree up for chances of infection or other pests getting in. So I know the state of Virginia, at least in Virginia's state forests, have tried a couple of different things to deal with this little aphid-like insect. They've released some insect predators, and they also have sort of treated trees individually with a pesticide that will be taken up by the hemlock, and then when the aphids feed on the hemlock, they die. But I know kind of all across the country, hemlocks are suffering. They have sort of no natural protections against the aphid-like insect, and so forestry departments and urban foresters are kind of really struggling to figure out how to protect our hemlocks and what can be done. So we will probably see less hemlocks in the future than we see now, unless something changes on that front. Okay. So we have finished now with our needle-like evergreens, right? So if we go all the way back here, I'm going to slide us all the way back. Remember that question very first question we can ask ourselves, are the leaves needle-like or are the leaves scale-like? We've made our way through all of our needle-like evergreens. So now we're going to move on to our scale-like evergreens, which I think are maybe more complicated simply because there's so many common names that don't match, right? The true genus or true family, lots of overlap. Lots of ways that they can be confused. So let's take a look. Moving forward again. Okay, so if you've got scale-like leaves, the first question you want to ask yourself are the sprays of leaves, which doesn't mean the whole twig, but like what we would think of as almost like a little leaf, although it's not. right? Are they flattened or are they irregular, right? Do they kind of jet off in every direction? And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a minute because I don't think these two images do the greatest job of illustrating what I mean, but I've got some examples here. Okay, can everybody see me? So we've got, let me also turn off this background here because once my sample goes away from my face, right, you can't see it. So give me 1 second. I would like no background. There we go. Okay. So you can see we're looking at an example of scale-like leaves that have flattened sprays. So I'm thinking of the spray as like this whole little chunk here, right? If I were, it's not the equivalent of a leaf, right? Because the leaves are the teeny tiny scale-like structures that we saw in the really zoomed up image, but sort of like almost like the whole twig, right, is really flat. We could press it between two pieces of paper and we wouldn't crush anything, right? So this is a flattened spray. On the other hand, we have scale-like leaves that have sprays that go in every possible direction. So here I'm looking at maybe, sorry, I'm losing some leaves here on my desk. If we're looking at this as one spray, you can see it really goes in every direction. It's not, we wouldn't say that it is flattened. If we put it between two sheets of paper, right, we would crush some of these little leaves, some of these little scale-like leaves and projections. Okay, so we've got flattened sprays and irregular or not flattened sprays. Does that make sense? Probably one of the more confusing aspects this evening. Okay, so let's go back to our slides real quick here. Okay, so again, we've got an evergreen tree. It's got scale-like leaves, and we're going to take a look at whether or not those scale-like leaves are arranged in flattened sprays or irregular / not flattened sprays. Okay, the other question that we're going to be asking are the cones woody or are the cones berry-like? And when we think of a woody cone, right, think of your classic pine cone. When we think of a berry-like cone, think of what you're seeing here, which is the cones of our eastern red cedar, or like our yews, right? When we were looking at the yews, they have a berry-like cone, right? Something very different than the woody classic structure that we think of when we think of the word cone. Okay, so let's say those sprays go in all directions. They're not flattened, they kind of go every which way. If we are noticing that the sprays go every which way, we then want to ask ourselves, well, what about the cones? Okay, so if the sprays are going in every direction and the plant has cones that are knobby and woody-like, you've got a member of the cypress family, right? And there are a number of cypresses that are native to the western part of the United States, and they hybridize, okay? It can be incredibly difficult to tell them apart in the field. And then we also have tons of ornamental varieties that have been intentionally crossed or intentionally hybridized, right? And the most common that's planted in our area is the leyland cypress. You'll often see it sort of planted in between yards or used as like a hedgerow because they grow very fast and they create kind of a nice barrier between one yard and another to provide for some privacy. So if you've got sprays that go in all directions and you've got these woody, knobby looking cones, you've got, right, some type of cypress, and chances are in our area, it's probably a leyland cypress or some other ornamental variety of cypress. And that might be as close as you can get, okay? If, on the other hand, those sprays go in every direction and there are berry-like cones, right, you've got an eastern red cedar or a member of the juniper family, right? This is where it gets super confusing. You've got a plant whose common name has the word cedar in it, which is a whole different family of evergreen trees, but it's actually in the juniper family, right? So our eastern red cedar is related and part of the same family as the plant we use to make gin, right? Those little blueberries are collected and used to make alcohol. Not the case with our eastern red cedar, but its cousin is used to do that. Okay, so If you're seeing, right, those sprays going in all directions, there are berry-like tiny little blue cones. You're looking at eastern red cedar. Eastern red cedar can be a little tough sometimes because the youngest scale-like leaves on eastern red cedar can be prickly, while the rest are not. So if you're looking at sprays going in every direction and the plant does have kind of tiny blue, right, berry-like cones, but it's got sort of prickly scales, right, chances are you're still looking at an eastern red cedar. Okay. Are we ready for flattened sprays?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Just making sure you all are still with me here. So again, we've got scale-like leaves. We're looking at our evergreen, doesn't have needles, it has scale-like leaves, and the sprays are flattened, right? They don't go in every direction, they're flat. The next question we want to ask is again about the cones, right? So if the sprays are flattened, and it has upright cones, we're looking at a plant that's in the Arborvitae family. Again, this is where things get very confusing. Our northern white cedar is also known as Arborvitae. Okay, it's got the name cedar in it. It is not a true cedar. It's an Arborvitae, and it's got cones that are upright. Okay, so you can kind of see them here in this image. This is the best image I could find of those flattened sprays and the upright little cones. I would say they're not much bigger than our hemlock cones. They're probably a little bit smaller actually, and they sit upright. So they'll be green in the summertime, and then, you know, as they dry out and they open up and the seeds are released, they turn brown. So that's what you're seeing here. But again, that upright position is what's going to clue you into it being an Arborvitae. Oriental Arborvitae is in a different genus, but it is really commonly planted in our area, and it's one of many, many, many non-native varieties and hybrids that look similar to our native Arborvitae. So again, this is an instance where you might have to be satisfied with just knowing that it's an Arborvitae without knowing specifically what it is. I can show you here. I've got an example of Oriental Arborvitae with me tonight, so I'm going to turn this off so you can see it big again. And you can see these cones are a little different. They do sit upright on the stem, okay, but they end up kind of opening in a really wide way, and they look a little different than our native Arborvitae. Okay, so our native Arborvitae is going to kind of retain that upright sort of tulipy shape even after they're dried out. But our Oriental Arborvitae, after it dries out and those seeds have dispersed, really opens up, almost looks like a little flower. Okay. And again, right, it's going to be really tough. They hybridize. There's all kinds of ornamental varieties that are crosses between species, both native and non-native. So sometimes just knowing like, okay, it's got flattened sprays, it's got these upright little woody cones, chances are it's some kind of Arborvitae, and that's maybe the best that I can do. I will also say, you know, there's a difference between walking around in the woods and walking around in your neighborhood. So if you're in the woods, deep in the forest, certainly you're probably more likely to be encountering a native species. If you're in someone's yard, could be anything. Okay. Okay. So if you've got woody cones that are not upright and are sort of knobby like the Leyland cypress cones we saw, but much tinier, you've got a member of the false cypress family, okay, which includes the Atlantic white cedar. Right, so again, right, common names can be so confusing. We've got a species here with cedar in the name. It's not a true cedar. It's in a different family than the northern white cedar, but we call it the Atlantic white cedar. Right, so it is a very different plant, but it's got flattened sprays and woody-like cones, and those cones are teeny tiny. So you're seeing teeny tiny cones here in the image, right? That's in the center. I don't have an Atlantic white cedar sample to show you, but I do have an ornamental variety. Couldn't tell you what kind of ornamental variety, but if you can see, it's got this teeny tiny knobby round cone that looks sort of similar to the knobby round cone we saw on the Leyland cypress, right? It's just much smaller, okay? And that kind of clues us in that it's a member of the false cypress family. And this is not our Atlantic white cedar that I'm holding, right? But it is probably some member of our false cypress family and ornamental variety, like our like our arborvitaes, right? Our false cypresses can hybridize. There's all kinds of ornamental varieties. So if you're walking around in the neighborhood, this is maybe as close as you're going to be able to get confidently. And I'd say you're doing pretty good if that's the case. Walking in the woods might be a different story. Although I will say in our area, you are probably unlikely to find Atlantic white cedar in the woods. They're really only common sort of in the swamps that you'd find on the coastal plain of Virginia. So along the coast, right? Not here in Arlington, most likely unless they've been planted intentionally. Okay, all right. So this page has a variety of resources that I wanted to share with you, books as well as websites. The two last resources are books. The first is the Peterson Field Guide to Eastern Trees, which includes evergreens and conifers. And I really love to take this one out in the field because it has a great dichotomous key that will help you kind of clue you in, and sort of the same way that we did tonight together through the presentation, walk you through a series of questions to help you get to your answer. The Sibley Guide to Trees is not a dichotomous key. It has lovely information in it, has beautiful illustrations. It has lots of species that can be found all across the US. So if you're kind of wondering about some of those ornamentals, this is maybe a good place to look for them. I really love it. Just to kind of browse through it and look through it, but I would say you kind of have to, if you're going to use it for identification purposes, you already kind of have to have a little bit of a head start with something like your Peterson Field Guide. The Virginia Department of Forestry has a lovely Common Native Trees of Virginia book that you can purchase, and of course some of the pages include, right, our evergreens and our conifers. The gymnosperm database is a really nice guide to all types of conifers and other gymnosperms, which conifers are part of, all across the world. So that's just fun to sort of browse. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources has a nice basic conifer key that I actually worked on when I was an intern a long time ago. So that's this. It's available online as a PDF. And then these three universities have websites that have some form of a dichotomous key that you can use to kind of clue you into where you are. Okay. So those are my suggested resources if you want to learn more. I will also say, I'll send out the slides. A lot of the information that I've included in the slides, particularly when it comes to measurements of needles and cone sizes, are averages. So if it says, right, loblolly needles are 7 inches long. Really, loblolly needles might be as short as 5 inches or as long as 9 inches. So there is some variety there. And a lot of these sources will give you that range. Okay, I've just kind of tried to simplify it for the sake of our presentation this evening. But some of these other sources will give you that range, right? So if you find, I think it's a loblolly, but it's not exactly 7 inches long, right? There's some wiggle room there. Okay. That is all that I had for us this evening. I feel like that was a lot of information at once, but hopefully it's given you a framework to start thinking about how you might identify evergreens when you're out in the field. Again, right, starting by, does it have broadleaves or not, right? We've only got a few broadleaf evergreens, and then if it has, right, needle-like leaves or scale-like leaves, and going down from there, okay? Asking and answering those questions that we went through, the clustered or not clustered, how many needles in a cluster, right? And then looking at the cones and some of the other identifying features of the tree will help get you to where you need to be.